Each week, American Artifacts takes viewers to archives, museums, and historic sites around the country. Next, from our tour of Appomattox Courthouse National Historical Park in Virginia, we visit the McLean House, site of Confederate General Robert E. Lee's surrender of his Army of Northern Virginia to Union General Ulysses S. Grant.
We're now inside the parlor of the home of Wilmer McLean, Appomattox County resident, who moved here in the fall of 1862. General Lee and General Grant corresponded for over 3 days, and finally, after being effectively surrounded here, General Lee wished to have a meeting with General Grant to surrender his army. Lee sent Lieutenant Colonel Charles Marshall of his staff into the village to find a suitable place to meet, and he encountered Wilmer McLean, and McLean offered his own home. Lee arrived here at about 1 o'clock, sat here at this marble-top table. General Grant, after riding over 20 miles, arrived at about 1:30, and when he came in, he sat at the oval wooden table here. The two had met each other in the Mexican War, and that was their first discussion. They talked about the Mexican War for quite a while, and the conversation got quite pleasant, and General Lee reminded General Grant the nature of this meeting and asked General Grant to put his terms in writing. Grant sat down and set his terms in writing for General Lee. Principally, the Confederate officers were going to be paroled and allowed to go home. He was going to allow the officers to keep their sidearms and personal baggage. And General Lee later asks if his men can keep their horses. Grant initially says no, that is not in the terms, but thinks about it for a minute and says that he understands that most of these men are small farmers and they could use those horses, and he will not rewrite it into the terms, but will allow the Confederate soldiers to keep their horses if they owned one. General Lee said this would have a very happy effect upon his army. The terms are read over by General Lee and given back to General Grant. General Grant calls forward Theodore Bowers of his staff to write out these terms in ink. Bowers is nervous, he botches the job, and he turns it over to Ely Parker. Ely Parker is a Seneca Indian. Say he had the best penmanship in the Army and General Grant's staff, and he actually writes out the formal terms for General Grant. General Lee's staff officer is Lieutenant Colonel Charles Marshall. He writes the acceptance letter. They exchange those letters. That's how the surrender is effected, the exchange of the letters. They both do not sign one document. Over the course of the meeting, General Grant introduces officers of his staff to General Lee. Some of them General Lee knows very well, such as Seth Williams, who was Lee's adjutant when Lee was a commandant at United States Military Academy at West Point. Another interesting aspect of General Grant's staff, there was a young captain named Robert Lincoln on his staff, and he, of course, was the son of President Abraham Lincoln, and he was here in the room. Another interesting participant in this ceremony was or at least maybe not participant, but a witness to this ceremony, was this rag doll of Lula McLean, youngest daughter of Wilmer McLean. It was sitting on the horsehair couch when the officers came in, and they moved it to the mantel during the meeting. After the meeting, some of the officers took the doll off the mantel and began tossing it around. Captain Thomas Moore of General Philip Sheridan's staff took the doll home with him as a war souvenir. In the 1990s, the family wanted the doll to come back to Appomattox Courthouse, and it is now on display in the Park Visitor Center. The meeting lasted about an hour and a half. It was said to be a gentleman's agreement. General Grant was very generous with the terms. In the end, when General Lee says he has nothing to feed his men, General Grant orders rations to be sent to feed Lee's army. The men shake hands. General Lee departs, goes out into the yard, calls for his horse Traveler, and rides back to the Confederate Army, bearing the news of his surrender.
You can watch this or other American Artifacts programs at any time by visiting our website, cspan.org/history.